Support comes from Sunday Morning Cafe, presenting Resilience and Creativity, a concert and interview with Royce Martin, creator of Swag Time, and resilience researcher Dr. Tom Wagner on August 2nd, sundaymorningcafe.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. This weekend, the 4th of July, will bring thousands of people to downtown St. Louis. They'll watch the floats of the annual parade, but there are deeper meanings to this spectacle. Behind it is a group with a controversial history. When it was founded in 1878 by a former Confederate cavalry officer, it was called the Veiled Prophet Society. Today, the group lives on as VP St. Louis. Its leaders are behind the nonprofit Celebrate St. Louis and the America's Birthday Parade. The event is returning to St. Louis this weekend after taking last year off. Under its previous names, the Veiled Prophet Society spent years as a visible part of the city's social and business scenes. Its members represented the city's wealthiest and most powerful families. That part hasn't changed, but other things have. For instance, the group accepted its first Black members in 1979. The past, present, and uncertain future of the Veiled Prophet in St. Louis. These are subjects of a new book from local author Devin O'Shea, who has spent years researching the group and its impact. The book is titled The Veiled Prophet: Secret Societies, White Supremacy, and the Struggle for St. Louis. It is O'Shea's debut book. Last month, he sat down with producer Danny Wicentowski. They began by talking about the inspiration for O'Shea's years-long fascination with the Veiled Prophet.
Well, I was casting around for an idea to write a novel about St. Louis, and I'm a big fan of Thomas Pynchon, and so he writes like historical fiction that's kind of wacky and crazy. And my mom was sort of thinking through St. Louis stuff with me, and then she's like stumbled across, wasn't there that strange parade during the summer that was headed by kind of a weird looking guy? And that kind of started me off down a very dark path.
Yeah. Now that weird looking guy, he was the guest of honor at a number of events in St. Louis, and we're going to talk about those. There was the Veiled Prophet Ball. There was the VP Parade, as you've just mentioned. Help us kind of understand the fiction from the reality. Who is the Veiled Prophet? Why was this story so fertile for this organization when it was founded in the late 1870s?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because that line of interrogation goes in so many different directions, including, my ears perk up at, he's from Persia. That's interesting. It's the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, which is a province in Iran.
A real place.
A real place. But of course, if you dig a little deeper, I think the first piece of problematic evidence you come across is like the Veiled Prophet, when he is first introduced in St. Louis in the Missouri Republican newspaper, he is a gun-wielding, very mean-looking clown. He's got one pistol and a rifle and another rifle behind him and possibly a Bowie knife tucked into his belt. And in this newspaper clipping, he is coming to St. Louis to shoot striking trolley workers, or he won't let them get in his way. And it's an advertisement for the first Veiled Prophet Parade.
Now, let me just pause here, because this advertisement and this image of the Veiled Prophet, this figure coming to town, this was part of a huge PR campaign that the St. Louis newspapers wanted to put on. They wanted people to know about an event in 1878.
Yes.
The way this event was marketed, was it for the public? Was it supposed to be a celebration? What were they supposed to feel about this figure who appeared in the paper, identified as the Veiled Prophet who's coming to town?
Yeah, it is the start of a tradition. So it's always a little awkward to try to get a bunch of people out to a party, but it was very much designed for the public. It just so happened to be 1 year after the biggest general strike in St. Louis history, the 1877 railroad strike. That was a nationwide strike, but in St. Louis it was particularly galvanizing across many different professions. And so there's also a lot of reason to believe that that the first veiled prophet is coming to town to shoot striking trolley workers and to commemorate the crushing of the strike of the summer before, which was still giving a lot of anxiety to the city fathers. And of course, we know that the first veiled prophet was the chief of police, who was John Priest, famously, who had crushed the strike.
Now, I think we're going to look more at these connections of this strike and this event and the fact that they take place so closely together and involve many of the same people. But there's really one person that you spend a great deal of the beginning portion of this book, and he kind of encapsulates the mystery and drama and disturbing kind of backstory of this event, and that is Alonzo Slayback.
That's right.
He is an author. He is a man of great emotion and occasionally violence. He is a former Confederate colonel who does not leave that part of his identity in the past. Tell us a little bit about Alonzo Slayback. Why did he become the sort of gravitational center of this St. Louis society that really wanted to have a local party that everyone would like?
Yeah, he is a larger-than-life character. If you've seen Gangs of New York, we're talking like a Bill the Butcher kind of like extravagant nativist. But the book, I go through and track Alonzo's upbringing and from Plum Grove, Missouri to St. Joseph's for the Bleeding Kansas border wars. Alonzo Slayback is a man who was born to defend slavery and wanted with every day to like progress slavery and to join the Confederacy as soon as he could and to help traffic arms to it and to expand slavery, especially into the West. And so as soon as the Civil War pops off, Alonzo Slayback becomes a cavalry officer. Again, this name is a very Pynchon-esque name also. He sounds like a villain.
It's stranger than fiction. It really is.
Yeah, and he is he's very interested in chivalry, which was also a big brain bug in the 1800s of just masculinity was very much modeled on a knight in shining armor who does vigilante violence on behalf of higher ideals. And so Alonzo also becomes a cavalry officer, as you said. He is in charge of Slayback's Lancers, and cavalry officers are known as being, they are the jet fighter pilots of the Civil War. They are crazy and they have to hurtle on a horse into gunfire. Of course, the Civil War does not pan out for Alonzo as a Confederate. He ends up in Mexico for a period in exile, trying to found another slave colony in Mexico called the New Virginia Colony. That eventually does not work out, and he slips back into the United States, does a little ironclad oath, and becomes a lawyer in St. Louis.
And that ironclad oath, that was the policy in Missouri as the state was dealing with all these former Confederates. They integrated a different kind of integration, but a lot of these former Confederate soldiers and officials back into society made them swear an oath that they never had loyalty to the Confederacy.
Yeah, which would have, saved everyone a lot of headache and time if there had been more barriers to reentry, especially for powerful Confederate officers, people who are unapologetically pro-slavery.
Now, take us into this moment of St. Louis. This is post-Civil War. We're into the era of Reconstruction. This is a time when St. Louis was discussed as a major metropolitan city in the country. It was discussed for a time as a possible capital to replace Washington, D.C. Remind us a little bit about what St. Louis was like at this point. What was its power structure like, and why was it seemingly so open to someone like Alonzo Slayback to come in and start marshaling people around for this idea of his?
Yeah, this is when he becomes Bill the Butcher, a Democratic sort of mob boss. Democratic as a sort of a joke in that sense, a guy who would sit at the ballot box and make sure that you were voting the right way or else rough you up. Or Alonzo was really good at like getting a gang together. And so he's in St. Louis at this time when, as you're saying, there's a lot of like conversation about moving Washington, D.C. to what should be the geographic center of the country, and it should be out here in what is quickly becoming like an industrial powerhouse that's hard to like wrap your brain around, of just how much like industry was feeding off of the river, especially, and the barges and the steamboat economy. You have to think of St. Louis as based entirely around where the arch is, of like that is the point of capital. That's like the node, is where you are getting product from South America up the river, and then it's being distributed through St. Louis on the rails, on wagons, and that requires an enormous amount of labor. But that's also just like where people are making money hand over fist. This is where a bunch of, a lot of people are making like wholesale good barons. So you're selling just stuff to people who are moving out west, or people who are trying to get in on the game that's happening here.
This is a center of the Gilded Age, the railways. It is unlike what we are experiencing now.
Yes, exactly. It is the exact opposite. Jay Gould, the robber barons, have a vested interest in St. Louis because there's also a bridge bottleneck. And so bridges are extremely expensive to produce, and we got one in the Eads Bridge. And so if you can own the network of rails that are going across that bridge, that's a powerful space.
And Alonzo Slayback felt like St. Louis wasn't getting the credit, or it could have more.
Well, him and his brother Charles is also a financier who, while Alonzo is fighting the war and then in exile, Charles is ratcheting up the social echelon in New Orleans. And so when the Long Depression hits in the early 1870s, Charles makes a bet on St. Louis, and Alonzo's already here. And so now you got both the Slayback brothers running around. Charles walks right into the Merchants Exchange and becomes the president shortly thereafter. And so you've got this powerful sort of political Confederate, larger than life character in Alonzo. You have to picture him on horseback, screaming, running into gunfire, and then the quieter money behind the scene of Charles, making sure that he's making lots of money on the grain industry, as well as the river barges, and that initial group of VP members is all representatives of the biggest, most booming industries in the city.
I'm talking today with Devin O'Shea about the Veiled Prophet Society of St. Louis. He has a new book out. It's called The Veiled Prophet, Secret Societies, White Supremacy, and the Struggle for St. Louis. In your book, when you get into the first Veiled Prophet Parade, or this first year of this event, and a lot of documentation about what Alonzo Slayback was writing and what him and his, collaborators, they really loved Mardi Gras in New Orleans.
For sure.
A lot of this, is trying to create kind of a St. Louis version of Mardi Gras. Mm-hmm. But you devote a great deal of information to something you mentioned a little bit before, this illustration of the Veiled Prophet that appears in the Missouri Republican newspaper. He looks like a Klansman. Mm-hmm. And it turns out there's a really good reason for that. The illustration was literally of a Klansman from a previous story that's readapted.
Right.
You draw some pretty strong arguments out of Alonzo Slayback's decision to use this illustration, and you build an argument in your book that I think VP St. Louis today would disagree with,
Sure.
which is that the KKK, the images, the history of the Ku Klux Klan, what that image was supposed to convey, that was intentional, and that was part of the founding of the Veiled Prophet. So I got to ask you kind of straight away, is the Veiled Prophet Society an expression of the KKK, or is it more complicated than that? Is that unfair to charge them with now, more than a century later, of being associated with such a heinous hate group?
I think that it is fair to say that that is a Klan character, and that our understanding of the Ku Klux Klan has got to have some historical context to it. And so you and I, and probably most of the listeners, are very familiar with the second wave of the Klan, which has standardized uniforms. This is the 1910s Birth of a Nation Klan that has a big Christian overtone to it, and it's very anti-Catholic, and it's also very anti-Semitic. That version of the Klan comes later. We're talking about a way previous version that is much more ad hoc. There's not as much fabric or costuming available in the first wave. And the way that the first wave of the Klan works in the 1860s and 70s is that they are reasserting plantation violence by putting on a costume and calling themselves Men from the Moon or the Ghosts of Shiloh, right? That they're supernatural beings who are coming back. This is also why we have like the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. This is all in the vein of a magical character who arrives to use violence to reassert white supremacy.
And why did Alonzo Slayback pick that? Like, he could have chosen something else. He could have just said, we're having a big, nice, generic party. But he, as you describe, selects that image and they repurpose that Klansman to be this veiled prophet and they put him in the newspaper. What do we know about why he did that?
Yeah, I think that it's important to think through also the context of the Ku Klux Acts during President Grant make it illegal to cover your face in public. They basically had to make it illegal to costume like a Klansman, and they also had to arrest and imprison and fine lots and lots of people in order to get rid of the first wave of the Klan. And so by 1878, when you've got the first veiled prophet in town, the stroke of genius that Alonzo is having is that he's able to smuggle the Klansman iconography into mainstream St. Louis culture by reusing this stamp, again, that came from a Southern Illinois news or a story about Klan violence in Southern Illinois. The stamp was not around, actually, for much of the time we've been trying to understand the Veiled Prophet Society. So for almost 100 years, there's been plausible deniability that the original one is a Klansman, even with the guns and the hood and all of the accoutrement. It's not until we digitize a bunch of newspapers that the Southern Illinois stamp comes out, and then it's like, oh, that stamp was in the same newspaper house. It was acquired by the Missouri Republican. Alonzo Slayback had a lot of newspaper connections. He was friends with every editor. And so reusing the stamp is a direct sort of expression of wanting to crush the multiracial general strike that had happened the year before.
And there was another cultural reference that Alonzo Slayback used, because this character of the veiled prophet, that was not an invention of the KKK. That was not related to any piece of American lore. This was related to a poem that was written a while before that. Why were these two ideas of, the KKK and a far-flung sort of fictional wizard who is in Persia, why are these two things being smashed together?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big mysteries of like what exactly is going on. And if you look at the history of Orientalism, especially in this Victorian era in the 1800s, there's a great deal of men like Alonzo Slayback who have gone to college and they've read 1001 Arabian Nights, and there's a very fanciful sort of, as Edward Said talks about in his book titled Orientalism, the Orient is a place for the Western Christian mind to go and sort of fantasize about things that they are not allowed to express in everyday life. And so there can be licentious, women of the Orient, that's a big one, but also encountering like a genie, or you imagine yourself to be a sultan with a harem and a bunch of slaves. So slavery also could be recovered through sort of Orientalists fantasizing. And the poem Lalla Rookh is very much a poem where the veiled prophet is a villain. He is like the devil maybe in disguise. And so I think there's a very intentional, we had mentioned that Alonzo Slayback had a really sharp imagination. He was also a poet himself. And that this inventing the veiled prophet as a Klan character is sort of like also a power fantasy, as we had said, about like reigniting plantation violence. The rule of the plantation comes back through this character.
So in 1878, after all of these conversations and efforts by Alonzo Slayback and other city leaders, there is the first Veiled Prophet Parade. This is before the Veiled Prophet Ball, before there's any debutantes. Mm-hmm. What was that first parade like?
Yeah, the first one is a little more violent than the ones that come afterwards, or explicitly violent, because you have the Veiled Prophet, who is John Priest, up on one of the parade floats next to a executioner in a executioner's costume, and then a bloody butcher's block between them. And so this was also a parade that went through the working class neighborhoods of St. Louis, which again had just shut down the entire city for a week and caused this big panic amongst the leadership. And so there's a very clear telegraphed message happening here that then in subsequent parades they try to sort of mix and match and dial it down and come back to like, well, maybe he's not so dark, and maybe he's, as the sort of lore from the Veiled Prophet Society says, maybe he's visiting us from a faraway place and he's here to bestow gifts upon us.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation with author Devin O'Shea about his new book, The Veiled Prophet: Secret Societies, White Supremacy, and the Struggle for St. Louis. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. We're listening today to an interview with St. Louis author Devin O'Shea about the Veiled Prophet Society and insights from his new book about the organization. Before the break, O'Shea introduced us to the group's founding by a former Confederate cavalry officer named Alonzo Slayback in 1878, and that year's first ever Veiled Prophet Parade. Nearly 150 years later, the organization and parade still exist, though under different names. Let's return to the conversation with O'Shea and producer Danny Wicentowski.
What can you tell of the reaction of the people in St. Louis? It's very interesting, I think, in your book, you both describe claims that the people love this. They are enjoying the electric lights and the splendor, but there are other descriptions that seem to show people being pretty ambivalent, or just they really want to throw peas at the Veiled Prophet, and this is actually a kind of form of public protest. What stands out to you?
Yeah, I think it's hard to really tell because, of course, the newspapers of the time are not really recording like on the street sort of reaction. Well, sometimes they are. There's a big mystery about who the Veiled Prophet is or who's in the club. And so there's a lot of like hearsay, and sometimes somebody has to go to the newspapers and say, I'm not in the club. It's a very theatrical and it's an intriguing sort of thing, I think, in popular consciousness. But then there's immediately sort of the rub that follows the Veiled Prophet Society through the next 100 years, which is, well, are they going to use all of the public streets? Am I allowed to have a chair on the lawn of the courthouse to watch the parade? This like private-public grist will continue. But of course, it's also just that like the mayor and all of the judges and the biggest business leaders in town are all in the society. And so when it's happening, it's like, oh, I can't get my thing signed because the judge is being the Veiled Prophet right now.
And not everybody could be in the Veiled Prophet Society. It was a whites-only organization, and it was that way for a great long period of time. I think let's skip some of that history, which you get into in a great deal, and I want us to go into the 1960s and 70s, so almost 100 years of Veiled Prophet balls. You almost go year by year, giving some highlights of this. But by the late 60s and 70s, there is a civil rights group called Action. There is a man named Percy Green.
Of course.
And things are looking very different for the Veiled Prophet organization. What is that situation? Why has this pressure mounted in the last 100 years?
Yeah, I think that it's no accident that in veiled prophet history, the biggest resistance comes when there is similar general strike atmospheres that also follow, wealth inequality. So in the 1930s, the United Electric Union has the rival veiled prophet ball, and they crown the queen of the United Electric, UE. But there's also black veiled prophet balls that are rivals to this one. That by the time you get to the 1960s with the civil rights movement, there's both the velvet plastic ball, then Action, which is an offshoot of CORE, is also doing the black veiled prophet, and that's just a rival sort of it's a counterball.
And they're protesting the actual veiled prophet. There are folks who are handcuffing themselves to objects or obstructing entrances. This becomes a pretty regular conflict.
Yeah, and as Percy has said before, if you wanted to get in front of every CEO in St. Louis, there was no better place to do it than the Veiled Prophet Ball.
Now, Percy Green, a very interesting character, someone who very early on connected the business situation in St. Louis and racial discrimination in employment with, as you mentioned, the fact that all of these business leaders are gathering together in the same place. And he made a similar connection to the legacy of this group in an interview on this show back in 2019.
But first and foremost, I want to be understood clearly that Action's protest of the White Veiled Prophet festivities was strictly part of a strategy to enhance our protest for fair employment at certain big businesses, not to be part of it. In fact, Action's view of the White Veiled Prophet as a Ku Klux Klan organization by another name.
And that was Percy Green, activist and protest organizer, speaking on this show in 2019. Devin, his point that the Veiled Prophet, this organization, was in effect responsible for the continued lack of employment of black people, for the racial exploitation. How right was he at that time? Was the Veiled Prophet preventing minorities and creating this a system of a racial segregation that was worthy of protest?
Yeah, it's hard to tell because we don't have the meeting minutes from the Veiled Prophet Society, but the Veiled Prophet group is a good way of representing this control that white people in St. Louis had over the economics of the city. And especially in the 60s, when you have deindustrialization hitting North St. Louis and the African American community first and hardest, and it's not being mentioned that much. Everything is going according to plan in the rest of St. Louis, and the black community is being basically sabotaged. You have then also the destruction and the failures and at Pruitt-Igoe, the sabotage of Pruitt-Igoe. At that time, there's an emergency happening in North St. Louis that is not getting any attention. And so Percy Green is, I think, reacting completely logically in that he is targeting this group of CEOs who are, again, worshiping a guy who claims to be infallible and who is credibly accused of being a Klansman, and connecting the costume to the economics, and that symbolic unity is what Action always was the best at.
Now, there was another element to the Veiled Prophet Society at this point. In the 1870s, it was the parade, but at some point it becomes a debutante ball, and that becomes a major, major focus of this organization. It becomes a televised event. You have young women who are in their incredible gowns, and they meet the Veiled Prophet and they bow to him. This social element, you go into, again, great detail in your book, the business leaders who meet their spouses or their children who marry into these families, the Bushes, the Kempers, you start running into these last names. How important was this as a social function for the families that had these famous last names?
Yeah, I think it is really important because one of the ways that I talk through the secret society that won't divulge its secrets is that it is a social technology that does something for the elites. And so one of the big things that happens at the end of the 1800s is that the group is sort of losing its muster as just a parade, and to get more of the wives and daughters involved, the debutante ball, then it goes from the belle of the ball to the queenship. And so then crowning the queen becomes a big annual event, very sought after by all of the daughters. And then you become like a little regional celebrity when you're the VP queen for that year, which again is complicated because it doesn't necessarily mean that the daughter herself is getting the accolade. It's actually a reward for the father who did the most for St. Louis that year.
And often it was only the daughters' names who would be published. The veiled prophet, of course, would be anonymous, and the male members also anonymous, but you would get to hear who was the queen this year, who was the maid of honor, and you'd start seeing these last names. Now, I talked to one former maid of honor of the Veiled Prophet Society. Her name is Lucy Ferris, and she was 18 years old in 1972. Her father was a local judge, and like a lot of folks, the Veiled Prophet was a tradition in her family. Her own aunt had been the Queen of Love and Beauty, and Lucy described a bit of what it meant to grow up knowing that you were going to be presented at this ball to the Veiled Prophet.
I was a WASP, like most of my friends, most of the young women who were presented at the Veiled Prophet. So, we went to Sunday school and we learned about Moses and we learned about Jesus and we learned about the Veiled Prophet. That is to say, I didn't learn about it in Sunday school, but because he wore those long robes and seemed to be a sort of godlike figure, it really felt as though he belonged in that sort of divine pantheon somewhere. And he was very much part of what your identity was as a St. Louisan, and by that I actually mean as part of the community that determined the fate of St. Louis.
And that was Lucy Ferris, a former maid of honor at the Veiled Prophet Ball. What stands out to you hearing that kind of psychology of a very young person who was asked to do this?
Yeah, I think if we think through the chivalry thing that we were talking about with Alonzo, and we're thinking about like the patriarchy and the sort of myth that the patriarchy spins about itself, it's that it has godlike powers, and that I think especially in that era, in the 50s and 60s, that there was so much power concentrated in the Veiled Prophet Society. You have the CEOs of every major company, from Monsanto to McDonnell Douglas to Anheuser-Busch. They're all in it. It is a very grand and now has decades of tradition attached to it. You experience this as a very grand tradition and a ceremony that seems, I think, a lot like church, but it is also heretical, and like it's not supposed to be a religious thing, but it has all of that. It has all the glitz and glamour of something that's supposed to be supernatural.
Now, Lucy Ferris, who we just listened to, she attended the 1972 Veiled Prophet Ball. This turned out to be a very momentous moment for this organization. Percy Green, who we heard from before, in action, along with Gina Scott and Jane Sauer, the women infiltrate the ball. Percy Green hangs out outside and waits for things to come together. But Gina Scott rappels down from an electrical wire, as wild as it sounds. She unmasks the Veiled Prophet in front of everyone. And this becomes news eventually. And this changes the group. The next year, I believe that it's just the following year is when the Veiled Prophet accepts its first black members. Why was this unveiling so important? What did it do to change this group and the city around it?
Yeah, I think it's so important because that was the Holy Grail buildup of the civil rights Percy Green action sort of campaign, to interrupt the parade, to picket the ball, the sort of the Holy Grail. I think later Keith Rose, a activist here in St. Louis, has always said that the pulling the veil off the Veiled Prophet is the Holy Grail of activism in the city still. And at that time, that uncloaking him would have demystified, I think, in a really powerful way, that this man who's supposed to be godlike is actually Tom K. Smith, the vice president of Monsanto, sort of at the height of Agent Orange production. The Vietnam War is raging. There is a intense lack of faith in the patriarchy, in the system that is currently in charge of, like, you know, society and where we're going as a people in the future. It's supposed to be these white men in this secret club, and to pull off the veil and show that he's mortal and just one of us, I think has a profound effect. And of course, then the secret that a bunch of cameras were in the room and a bunch of cameras went off, but no picture remains from that event. Very mysterious.
It was not reported by the Post-Dispatch initially or the reporters who were there. It had to come from the Gateway Journalism Review.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to move a bit closer to the present. The Veiled Prophet Society, it does not end after it is unveiled in 1978. It continues. The ball continues as it has done to this year. But its parade and its place in the city do change, and we start getting its parade becomes renamed. To cover a lot of history quickly, what happens after the Veiled Prophet is unveiled? Did it adjust? Did it finally meet history where it was?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that it retreats, but it's retreating step by step, very slowly over the course of the next 50 years. And so the first thing that goes is that they surrender the public arena that they were holding the ball at, and then they retreat to the Chase Park Plaza or a local hotel in order to do the actual ceremony. And so once you're out of that public space, which was a big ask for Percy in Action, then there's sort of like still a lot of intense coverage for the next few decades. In the 80s, then there's this moment where they are thinking about maybe ending it at the early 80s. They're thinking about ending the whole thing, and then they decided with the election of Ronald Reagan and this big resurgence of, the red, white, and blue sort of patriotism to put on the VP Fair instead.
We need to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue listening to this conversation with St. Louis author Devin O'Shea. His debut book, which explores the history of a secret society in St. Louis, is titled The Veiled Prophet. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Hi, I'm Laura Hamden, and my colleague Jessica Rogan and I are your daily hosts of the Gateway newsletter. We meet with the editors in the STLPR newsroom every weekday to bring you the top local stories of the day in a quick and easy 6-minute read by 6 a.m. In an age of overwhelm, it's a refreshing, thoughtful take on the news day, if we do say so ourselves. Fine-tune your daily news habit with the Gateway newsletter. Subscribe at stlpr.org/gateway.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. We've been talking today about the Veiled Prophet Society, its history, and the way it has changed to fit modern standards in the last century. The group is the subject of a new book by St. Louis author Devin O'Shea. Before the break, O'Shea described the way the Veiled Prophet Parade, an annual event, underwent several name and schedule changes. It is now the America's Birthday Parade, which returns to St. Louis for the 4th of July this Saturday. O'Shea spoke late last month with producer Danny Wicentowski. Let's return to that conversation.
We are about a week away from the Celebrate St. Louis parade, and it's on July 4th. It is tradition. That is the modern version of the Veiled Prophet Parade, and you can still see signs of it. If you look for it, I think you can still see VP. You can still see the date 1878 on some banners. Mm-hmm. And a couple years back, I had a chance to sit down with the COO of VP St. Louis, Michael Ruich, and we had a conversation both about my project that connected the Ferguson protests to the Veiled Prophet, but also just to ask him, what does this place mean for you? What does this organization mean to these people? And specifically, what does VP, the letters in VP St. Louis, mean? And this is what he told me.
VP is just letters. It stands for nothing. There is not Veiled Prophet. We've kept a VP, but it doesn't really represent anything.
That was Michael Ruich speaking to me in 2024 about the meaning of the letters VP in VP St. Louis. Devin, I was not very satisfied with that explanation. I did appreciate that he talked to us. It was very rare, and I don't know of another time when a VP official has discussed and also discussed the community work that they do. And they do volunteer work and community outreach in this, but that phrase, you discuss this in your book, that interview. What did you hear in Michael Ruich responding that VP essentially doesn't mean anything except for the name of the organization he represents?
There is so much evidence, about the original Veiled Prophet being a Klansman, but then, in the 1910s, when Birth of the Nation comes out, he's heralded as a Klansman. Slavery is a big component of the ceremony for decades and decades, up until the 1940s. And then you get to the Civil Rights Movement, and the Black community here says, we don't like this Klansman being part of civic life, and we need you to remove it. And then you get through another 50 years of people saying the Veiled Prophet is embarrassing. It seems like a white supremacist thing. It seems like a Klansman. And then to remove the meaning from Veiled Prophet and say that VP is just letters and it doesn't refer to anything, but then they still do have the character, or they have a character called the Grand Oracle, which has been a moniker for the Veiled Prophet since the beginning. And so I think what's happening here is a consultant came in and said, here's how you avoid this public relations thing while still keeping all of the stuff that you want to keep intact. And that's just not possible.
Devin, the Veiled Prophet group, VP St. Louis, as it now calls itself, it seems to continue to try and reshape its public image by downplaying some of this history. When I looked at this issue a couple years ago, the VP St. Louis website, it included a statement that I believe was initially released in response to when a celebrity named Ellie Kemper, there was news that she had been one of the queens, and she had disavowed the group as racist, and the group then came out with a statement. That statement said that the group fully disavows and unequivocally condemns racism in any form and disavows any racist past associated with the organization or its origins. That statement no longer appears on the VP St. Louis website that I checked in the last week. I did ask VP St. Louis, I reached out to them ahead of this interview, if they wanted to comment on your descriptions of their group and its history and to explain why that statement was removed. I did not hear back. Is the Veiled Prophet trying to erase its own history?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's trying to back up one step at a time in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense because it's dragging out the inevitable. Why is it that we couldn't just rebrand the debutante ball into the St. Louis debutante ball? The fleur-de-lis ball is overseen by the Archbishop. You could just have the mayor crown the queen of the debutante ball. Maybe that's not a good use of her time, but still, you can just come up with an alternative. You can cut the character. I think that what is happening is that we are, because we're fascinated with this, we are trying to look into the hive mind of a bunch of guys who are attending meetings and trying to figure out how to respond to changing mores and the social currents, and that they're not doing it very well, but that they want to hang on to, I think, a very powerful feeling, which is like, my predecessors who came before me, they were in this group and they were powerful, and I want to continue this tradition, and I don't want to give up, especially when you are pledging a fraternity and then you're initiated and then you become a member. These are powerful feelings of togetherness for elite men to bind each other together into a group, but they're powerful feelings nonetheless. And so that's why I think they're clinging to it so hard, is that there is real emotion involved. But we all have to then take a step back and say the emotion involved is hanging on to a character that is giving St. Louis a bad reputation. Every time he comes up, it's a bad time.
I want to mention again that I did reach out to VP St. Louis to ask them to respond to your book and its characterizations, and they did not get back to me. But I want to perhaps present maybe how I would imagine they might respond. I have spoken with members of them before. They have conveyed their feelings about my own coverage of that group and our descriptions of it. And I think perhaps fundamentally they might say that it actually doesn't mean anything, and that this group, they meet together, they spend huge amounts of money to try to make the city better, they try to bring more publicity, and they put on this big parade. They're trying to do good things and to have a party, and actually you're the one who keeps focusing on these KKK connections or things that exist only in its past. This group is not run by a Confederate colonel anymore. It has membership of people with different races and religions. Aren't you the one, perhaps a veiled prophet supporter might say, the one who's holding us back and keeping us in history and not moving on in some way? How would you respond to that, Devin?
Yeah, maybe I am the problem. No, I think that the problem that I have experienced a lot in St. Louis is that there is not a lot of democracy in the city. We get to vote sometimes on some things, but we live in a city that is very dominated by Republican politicians in Jefferson City in these gerrymandered districts, and now with the federal government being Republican, there's not a lot of feeling of control over the destiny of the city that I think regular people feel. And that does come from this legacy that this group has of anti-democratic collusion. And that happens in cities across America. That's not a uniquely St. Louis thing. But the criticism about the Veiled Prophet Society's past is still relevant because I think in order to create a democratic city, you do have to tackle the kinds of groups that collude and support each other's interests rather than the interests of the public. The current group tries to use charity as an excuse to exist and as an excuse to say we're giving back to St. Louis and that we put on a big parade and that we're giving lots of money to charities or something like that. I would argue that it would be a better use of everyone's time to try to go through more traditional avenues of charity. That the Veiled Prophet sort of charitable services does not have a meaningful impact on most people's lives, especially if you read through the Town and Style sort of write-ups about this. This is mostly going towards charter schools, or we're doing a little bit of gardening outside of a senior center. That's not a good use of time and money, especially with these members who have such spending capacity. There's lots of things to fix in St. Louis, and those things are negligible.
Devin, I think the question people might be asking themselves is, does VP St. Louis or this Veiled Prophet Society, are they still powerful? Do they control people's lives to some degree, or are we criticizing a party that we're not invited to?
I think that they don't have as much power as they used to. And that's a major reason why we can do sort of open criticism about them, is that they are not made up of the CEOs in town. As I say at the end of the book, this is also a product of the system that the Veiled Prophet represents, which is like capitalism, that the Veiled Prophet, the past members in the mid-century, when they're at the height of their power, they began to kill the golden goose. They, lobbied against antitrust law, and they wanted corporations to become bigger and bigger and bigger because they owned corporations, and so sure, they should get bigger and bigger. And then once you hit sort of like the post-2008 recession, you get conglomeration that takes all of these companies out of St. Louis, and so the big CEOs just aren't here anymore. And I think this comes up with the Bush family a lot, is that they gave away the golden goose. The brewery belongs to InBev now. It doesn't belong to the Bush family. And so they are the product of their own success in a big way, and that has taken sort of a lot of power out of St. Louis. It's sort of slipped through our fingers here, and that is their fault. That's their predecessor's fault.
Devin, at the end of your book, as you kind of share your final thoughts and the lessons that you're trying to leave readers with, I don't want to say that they're hopeful, but you do say that after evaluating all of these absurdities and all these different cultural threads and taking us through a great deal of history of the CIA, which is in this book as well.
Sure.
You write that as a St. Louisan, I am not disheartened by this ugly past. It is rancid and unnerving, but it's also necessary as a step forward to building the kind of city people might want to live in. What did you mean by that?
I think that my ultimate goal for the book is to use the Veiled Prophet as a teaching tool about class consciousness, but also about how it works in St. Louis and how secret societies factor in. But ultimately, it's to close a chapter of the city's history so that something else can begin. A more democratic city, a more open and egalitarian city, and the Veiled Prophet represents everything that is the antithesis of that. And so the book is meant to be sort of a way of coming to terms with the city's past, a thing that St. Louis is not very good at doing, especially when it comes to the racialized, discriminatory past in the city. There's many, beautiful outlets that are doing work on this all the time. But as a whole, St. Louis doesn't always want to look at itself and see, we were a slave city, or, we almost became part of the Confederacy, or we have been part of the problem in the civil rights movement. And that history still needs to be grappled with.
That was St. Louis author Devin O'Shea. Last week, Haymarket Books published his debut book, The Veiled Prophet: Secret Societies, White Supremacy, and the Struggle for St. Louis. O'Shea was interviewed by producer Danny Wicentowski.
This episode was produced by Danny Wicentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.